and welcome to the Western Library Reading Series, a program dedicated to showcasing the scholarly and creative work of Western faculty and staff by featuring diverse speakers from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines who are engaged in research, writing, and teaching in Western. And I'm very happy to introduce Rob Lopresti, librarian for environmental sciences, environmental studies, Canadian American Studies, government information, and maps here at Western. That's quite a list, but that's just one part of Rob. And today we have another part, another story. Rob is a writer of mystery fiction and also nonfiction. And some of his works, novels and mystery fiction, called Such a Killing Crime, Third Run Crime, Green Fellas, which is about bad guys cleaning up the environment, and that last title was called One of the Best Mysteries of 2015. Rob is the author of more than 60 short stories, published in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and others. He has won the Derringer Award twice, the Black Orchid Novella Award, and was nominated for the Anthony Award. And I didn't know what those were, so I had to look them up. And it's kind of interesting, the Derringer Award is for short stories because it's a small pistol. And the Black Orchid Novella Award is based on a character, Nero Wolfe, by an author, Rex Stout, who loves food, beer, and orchids. And finally, the Anthony Award is named after Anthony Butcher, one of the founders of the Mystery Writers of America. For nonfiction, Rob has written an essay in American libraries titled How Overdue Books Caused the Civil War. And you'll have to ask him more about that. And personally, I know Rob also as a musician and songwriter and a longtime member of the folk music community here in Bellingham. Today we celebrate his newest book, When Women Didn't Count, the chronic mismeasure and marginalization of American women in federal statistics. And one note from Rob's own description, telling the startling facts of how women have been sidelined, neglected, and just plain lied about for more than 2 centuries. Also, I went on Amazon to look at how the book was received on Amazon, and there's a review there that says the research behind this book is truly amazing, and it has an Amazon rating of 5 out of 5 stars. So, please welcome
Thank you so much, Peter. Can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate you coming. And let's see what we can do here. We are here to celebrate this book. For sale in the back, too, thanks to the bookstore. And it was published last June by Prager Press, which is an academic press. They publish mainly for libraries, which makes sense, doesn't it? And as Peter said, it is a book about how women have appeared and disappeared in government statistics over the last 230 years. And obviously the best way to start a discussion of government statistics, as I'm sure all of you would agree, is with a quiz show. So we are going to start with a quiz show, and I have 3 volunteers who are very kind to participate. And would you come up, please? Nicole. Come on. Round of applause. And Elizabeth. Stay over here if that's okay. Is this going to drive you crazy? Okay. And John. All right. So, Nicole and Elizabeth are our lucky contestants. John is the scorekeeper. He may think he's luckier still because he doesn't have to answer the questions. And There you go, John. You can sit down. And I will tell you when someone gets a point. And here's the way it works. There are 8 multiple choice questions. Each question has 3 answers. And if Nicole goes first, if Nicole will go first, and if she gets the answer correct, she gets 2 points. If she doesn't, Elizabeth goes, and if she gets it right, she gets 1 point. Second question, we reverse. Everyone clear? Okay. And let's see. I guess that's it. Okay, so here we go with the first question. Oh, by the way, if you had, you can also see here, and I'll read it to you. If you had memorized this book, my book, you would know the answer to all these questions. If you memorize this book, you really need a better hobby. Okay, a 1912 report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture on the subject of wages of farm labor ends by angrily denying that either A, farm life drives women insane, B, farm wives were demanding to be paid, or C, women are better cooks than men. So, Nicole. Nicole says B, farm wives were demanding to be paid. No. So, your choices are farm life drives women insane, or women are better cooks than men. A, farm life drives women insane. That is correct. 1 point for Elizabeth. Okay. Here's the report, and it talks about insanity of farm women, a persistent calumny, I had to look that up, without the least foundation. And it explains that various articles in magazines have been claiming that farm life was so dull and repetitive and hard that it was driving women insane. And he actually talked to a superintendent of an insane asylum in the state of Iowa who said there was no evidence of this. So you don't expect to find that in a report on wage statistics, but there it is. Okay, question number 2. A 2009 report on stalking. By the way, when I say reports, publications, everything here is from the federal government, okay? A 2009 publication on stalking and harassment accidentally included reports about what? Bill collectors, drug interventions, or marriage proposals? Elizabeth? C, marriage proposals? No. Nicole? B, drug intervention? No. Bill collectors. This is the revised report that came out 3 years later. And the reason it was revised was when they asked people whether they had experienced repetitive and unsolicited communications, they were going after stalkers, they actually got comments about spam email, internet scams, and contacts from telemarketers and bill collectors, and they didn't catch that in time, so they had to republish the whole book. With your tax dollars, of course. Question number 3. In 1920, which department published a pamphlet titled Happy, Healthy Womanhood? The Interior Department, which, by the way, nowadays mostly handles parks, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Land Management, and so on. State Department, which handles foreign countries, and Treasury Department, which has the IRS and the Mint, and so on. So, which of these put out a publication called Healthy, Happy Womanhood? Nicole? C, the Treasury Department. Give that woman 2 points. Okay? All right. Why in the world were they doing that? Well, in those days, the Treasury Department included the Public Health Service. There was no Department of Health and Human Services. Okay? The pamphlet, by the way, began, almost everything I'm showing you can find either in our collection or on the web, or both. And this pamphlet begins by talking to young women about the importance of exercise and nutrition, and finally gets on to its main subject, which is explaining how they had to watch out for men with venereal disease. That's what they were really interested in. Question number 4. A report on the 1900 census did not compare housewives to which of these groups? Institutionalized persons, meaning people in insane asylums, for example, prisoners, or soldiers? Elizabeth? Did not compare. In other words, it compared housewives to 2 of these groups. Which one did it not compare them to?
Soldiers.
Soldiers. Yes. Very good. So 2 points for Elizabeth there, right? Okay, and it was discussing the concept of gainful employment. I actually have an entire chapter on the concept of gainful employment, believe it or not. And it says inmates of prisons, almshouses, that would be poorhouses, and benevolent institutions are also placed in the non-gainful class, although they may be productively employed. So, in other words, a person in a prison might be doing work every day, but he's not competing in the marketplace, so he's not gainfully employed. And they said, in that way, these inmates are much the same as housewives. They carry their wares to market, but they are not considered gainfully employed, but they are not regarded as a burden upon the community. Okay? Question number 5. When did the Supreme Court decide that the Constitution permitted married couples to use birth control? 1925, 1945, or 1965? Nicole? C, 1965. Yes. And I will give an extra, so that's 2 points for Nicole. I will give an extra point to either of you, raise your hand if you know, what famous phrase made its first appearance in the Supreme Court? Janae knows. What famous phrase, she's a lawyer, what famous phrase made its first appearance in the Supreme Court decision in this case? Okay. Janae, do you know? No? Okay. Right to privacy. Okay. Which the Constitution, which the Supreme Court somehow found hidden in the Constitution, although the words never appear. Okay. It was 7 years later that the Supreme Court decided that non-married people could also use birth control. Okay. Which, by the way, in either case did not mean that it was illegal around the country. It just meant that the Constitution, the Supreme Court was saying that certain states that had outlawed it, that was kicked out. Okay. It was legal in most of the country by then. Okay. Question number 6. According to the 1850 census, which group of women had the highest incidence of insanity compared to men in the same group? Okay? In other words, there were X number of women, free-colored women, that's the phrase they used, slaves, or white women. Okay? Do you understand the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Elizabeth?
C.
C's. Whites. No. Nicole? Free-coloreds or slaves?
B.
B, slaves. 1 point for Nicole. Okay. Now what you'll see if you look here is that the number of white men and women who were listed as insane in, by the way, 1850 was the first year that the census had statistics on health. Okay. The number of white men and women was approximately equal. The free-colored men and women, slightly more females. But slaves are about 50% more women than men. And I thought that really required some explanation, so I found a woman who was an expert who had written many articles on the psychology of American slavery, and I asked her if she could explain it. And her response was, could you send me that? I've never heard of that. So I sent her the page, and then she suggested I talk to her mentor, who had written even more on the subject, and his reply was, could you send me that? I've never heard of that. Which made me very proud, by the way, because I thought the main accomplishment of my book was going to be creating context for this stuff that experts already knew about, you know. But I actually contributed a primary source that the experts in the field were unaware of, added it to the communication or the conversation, which is always nice. Okay. Number 7, the 1940 census recorded 3,600 men who washed clothes for private families. What did they list as the men's occupation? Engineers, garment sanitizers, or laundresses? And it is Nicole.
C.
C, laundresses, correct. Okay. It wasn't until the 1970s that the government started thinking about non-gender specific terms for occupations. Okay. So the men had to be listed as laundresses. Okay. Last question. Isn't this exciting? According to the Commissioner of Education in 1930, what was the real reason for the present breakdown of the family? That's his phrase. Real reason for the present breakdown of the family in 1930. Domestic violence, poverty, or working women? Elizabeth?
C.
Working women. Yeah, you figured out how this works. Yes. This was a conference, a symposium on home and family life in a changing civilization. There were 4 speakers. Notice all the speakers were men discussing home life. And William John Cooper, who was the superintendent of instruction for the entire country, explained that in agricultural times, if a girls of a family did not want to get married, they stayed home and managed the spinning, and hence the term spinster. But if a girl did not care for that life, she exchanged one tyrant, her father, for a younger one, her husband. But this has changed. A girl can now escape almost any kind of occupation she desires, and this is the real reason for the present breakdown of the family. Okay? Okay, the good old days. 19, okay, so the scores. John.
Score. Elizabeth has 5 points, Nicole wins with 7 points.
All right, yay! So, my Thomas prizes. I'm sorry, Nicole won, right?
Yes.
Yes. Nicole, this is a copy of my first novel. There you go. Congratulations. And Elizabeth, second prize, you get 2 copies of my novel. This is a copy of a CD with 18 of my songs, including the reference library in blues. And John, you get a copy too. Thank you. Okay. I should explain that all the pictures you're going to see, or that you have seen, except the cover of the book, all the pictures are from government publications, and they do not appear in the book, by the way. All right. So how did this book get started? Yes, that is an official housewife's uniform from 1918. How did this book get started? Well, I am the government information librarian. I have been doing what used to be called GovDocs and is now called government information for 40 years. So I've looked at a lot of government publications. And whenever I happen to help somebody with statistics and I have the time, I always pick up the front of the book and look at the introduction, because that's where the book, in a book of statistics, the introduction is where they explain what doesn't work. Okay? This is, these numbers don't really work, that's kind of screwed up here, because you don't usually find that in the tables. Okay? And so in the 1920 Census of Population, the volume on occupations, this appeared. And I can't read this tiny print, so I'm going to have to come out here. Unusual occupations for women. Okay. And what it explains is that as in previous censuses, the census takers, which they call enumerators, who went door to door, recorded women in a lot of unusual occupations, peculiar occupations. And they said every time one of those occupations was recorded, the people back at the census office looked at it and tried to figure out what the mistake was. And sometimes they said, oh, it's the wrong gender, or it's the wrong occupation, and they changed it. Okay? If they couldn't figure out what the mistake was, they said they left it, even though they were sure that women were not really working as, let's see, millers or plasterers or telephone linemen. And looking at that with 100 years of 20/20 hindsight, I said, oh my God, how many women who were pioneers in their fields were just erased out of history due to what is known as the fallacy of personal incredulity. It can't be true because I don't believe it. Okay? So that's what got me started on this subject, and I started looking, trying to figure out what else might be wrong in government statistics related to women. And this is essentially what I found. This is a word cloud listing the 50 words that appear most often in my book. And when I did this first with a different word cloud generator, the word that came up most often was men, and I almost had a coronary. Was it actually possible the word men appeared more than women? No, what happened, of course, was it was finding the word men in the word women. Okay? So I threw that out and found a different word cloud generator. So if you take a look at that, that essentially tells you what the main things that are covered here. And I'm not going to list all 27 chapters, but these are the sections of the book that the chapters fall into, so it gives you some idea what you'll find here. Okay? And the chapter that I'm going to read for you, is the chapter on prostitution. Is that an ugly picture? That is a government poster from World War II aimed at discouraging sailors and soldiers from getting involved in something that could cause venereal disease. Okay? And let's move on to a slightly less ugly picture there. So the reason I chose this chapter, by the way, is I know that the Gender Studies program is teaching a course this quarter on sex trafficking. Did anyone from that class show up today?
Last quarter.
Oh, it was last quarter, not this quarter?
It's most quarters.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we'll see. I'm going to read that chapter to you. There will be illustrations along the way. Here we go. It's chapter 16, in case you wondered. Oh, I'm sorry. I lied. It's chapter 22. In the Bureau of Labor Statistics 1911 report, Relation Between Occupation and Criminality of Women. And now I have to stop. Okay. I will not interrupt myself too often, but this is actually my favorite source in the entire book. Okay. Let me explain. In 1907, Congress authorized the Bureau of Labor, there was no Department of Labor, to study how women and children were affected by working outside the home. I do not mean how children were affected by women working outside the home. I mean the fact that children were also working in farms and factories and mills. Okay? And what came out was a 19-volume report. It was pretty controversial in its day, especially the southern states did not like what was said about them. My favorite of those volumes, by the way, all these volumes are available on the World Wide Web, and we have most of them in paper. And my favorite volume, here it is volume 15, Relation Between Occupation and Criminality of Women. Mary Connington was the author, and she was assigned to look into the widespread belief that working in department stores and factories led women to lives of crime. Spoiler alert, she decided it wasn't true. It's a fascinating book. I'm not being sarcastic. That particular book out of all 19 is the most interesting. Okay. So, in the Bureau of Labor Statistics 1911 report, Relation Between Occupation and Criminality of Women, author Mary Connington reached page 82 out of 120 before mentioning the word prostitute. Instead, she spoke of what is technically known as immorality, or professionally immoral women. And it is not always clear when she was referring to what she was finally referred to as occasional prostitutes, professional prostitutes, kept women, or simply the women who had sex outside of marriage. She even noted one department store manager whose definition of immorality included any woman speaking to men in a free and easy manner. One of the difficulties in tracing statistics about prostitution is the many euphemisms for what has been nicknamed the oldest profession, and is more recently often called sex work. The latter term has not been embraced by the federal government, although the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention does use it in discussing HIV prevention. Another difficulty was illustrated by Census Superintendent Francis Amasa Walker in his report on the 1870 census. He said, this is a little hard to follow, it's 1870s prose, but I will explain it if you don't have trouble following. The following tables embrace gainful and reputable occupations only. All persons, moreover, whose means of livelihood are criminal, or in the general judgment of mankind, shameful, are excluded. The reason for excluding gamblers, prostitutes, keepers of brothels, and such persons from the table of occupations has not been found in any sensitiveness at the mention or recognition of these classes as actually existing in the community, but in the consideration that from the necessity of the case, the numbers thus reported must be wholly inadequate to the fact, and that a seeming count of them in the census would have the effect to mislead rather than instruct. Here and there, at the enumeration of the ninth census, such persons had the assurance to report themselves by their true designations. Or assistant marshals, that's the census takers, took the responsibility and in some cases the risk of writing down the real occupations of members of those classes who sought to misstate their avocations or to disguise them in ambiguous terms. But an analysis of the schedule soon made it evident that this had not been done, as indeed it was not expected, with such uniformity as to secure even approximately correct results. All such titles are therefore dropped. So what he's saying, if you didn't follow that, is some women or some people well, it could be gamblers or other people, we'll just say women. Some women listed themselves as prostitutes in the census, but since they could assume that such a small percentage of people did, they leave it out because it would be misleadingly low. You follow that? Okay. The published report of the next census, as usual, listed no prostitutes. Nonetheless, their existence in the records can be detected. In the report on the defective, dependent, and delinquent classes of the 1880 census, Frederick Howard Wines noted that houses of prostitution to the number of 4,000 are reported in 180 towns. In 94 other towns, there are said to be none. Some 215 towns have no information. If any value is to be attached to the statements made by the heads of police departments, and I do not see how it is possible to refuse them a certain amount of credence, the number of such houses cannot exceed 5,000 or 6,000. On the supposition that in the large and small places taken together, the number of inmates averages 5, there are not in the United States more than 30,000 prostitutes of open description. Wines noted that certain cities claim to be free from this curse, with the largest being the city of Brooklyn, New York, where the chief of police insists that his statement must be accepted as literally and absolutely correct. Wines said, if these towns are as virtuous as they claim to be, they are indeed fortunate. If not, the police are blind. Government report. But if there were, as Wines deduced, 30,000 prostitutes in the United States, where are they hiding in the census reports? The Integrated Public Use Microdata series is a project of the University of Minnesota and examines a sample of the complete records for individuals on older censuses. The IPUM sample from 1880 discovered 74 women. In other words, the IPUM sample looks at the actual handwritten records from these old censuses, okay? Not the published records. And the sample found 74 women who had listed themselves as prostitutes. It is, however, impossible to tell where they were buried in the published reports. Were they listed as having no occupations? Were they listed as seamstresses, which is a famous euphemism for prostitutes in some places? We don't know. And by the way, there's an embarrassing omission in my book. And that is, I said it was a sample, but I didn't say what kind of a sample. It was a 5% sample. So if you assume there were 74 women in a 5% sample, that would be about 1,500 women, we can assume, who in 1880 listed themselves as prostitutes. What percentage of actual prostitutes listed themselves that way? We have no clue. In 1889, Carroll Wright, that's Carroll with 2 R's, it's a gentleman, the first Commissioner of Labor and a future superintendent of the census, wrote a government report on working women in large cities. The data was gathered by interviews conducted with more than 17,000 women. All of the interviews were performed by women census agents, except those on the section of the character of working women. That was made up by male agents who spoke with almost 4,000 prostitutes to determine their previous occupations. Wright wrote, it is often flippantly asserted that the shop girls, the women who worked in department stores, for example, those comprising the class under the investigation in this report, recruit the ranks of prostitution. He warned that his data was only about what may be called professional prostitutes, quiet, unobtrusive, unobserved prostitution, which exists in all communities, has no place in the present study. Wright noted a fact which strikes one sadly, the large number who enter prostitution directly from their homes. That was almost 1/3 of the total. Nearly 30% of the prostitutes had previously done housework, hotel work, and cooking, which are considered traditional occupations for women in those days. A mere 13% had been dressmakers or worked in factories. Wright concluded that one need not hesitate in asserting that the working women of the country are as honest and virtuous as any other class of citizens. The subject shows up in a different way in the Census Bureau report, Marriage and Divorce, 1867-1906. Prostitution before marriage was one of the more than 400 causes or combinations of causes given for divorce, and it was granted to divorces were granted to 36 men for that reason. In 1907, Congress responded to concerns over foreigners arriving in this country. Does that sound familiar? Foreigners arriving in this country by creating the U.S. Commission on Immigration, better known as the Dillingham Commission. It was particularly interested in determining the ethnic background of the newcomers, even creating a dictionary of races and peoples. And boy, if you've ever heard the term politically incorrect, go to the dictionary of races and peoples. I was amazed at what it said about my Sicilian background. But one of its 40 reports was Importing Women for Immoral Purposes, 1909. The book was based in part on investigations by undercover agents, which involved danger. Quote, one woman agent was attacked and beaten, escaping serious injury, if not murder, only with greatest difficulty. And yet the next day she went cheerfully back to her work, though of course in another location where she was not known. The commission stated that, quote, the importation and harboring of alien women and girls for immoral purposes and the practice of prostitution by them, the so-called white slave traffic, is the most pitiful and most revolting phase of the immigration question. It also distinguished between the recruitment of immoral women and innocent girls. The Dillingham Commission noted that in 1907, 93 women were deported through Ellis Island for prostitution. Of those convicted of prostitution in night courts in New York City, 1,500 were native-born, almost 600 foreigners. As for the phrase white slave traffic, mentioned by the Dillingham Commission, a modern writer noted, progressive era reformers used the catchwords white slavery to promote the vision of women held in bondage against their will, mysterious druggings, abductions of hopeless young girls, and of unexplained disappearances of innocent and naive immigrants forced into lives of prostitution and vice. A year after the report was published, Congress took action in the form of the White Slave Traffic Act, better known as, anyone know? The Mann Act. The Mann Act, which is still in effect today, made it a federal crime to transport in interstate or foreign commerce, quote, any woman or girl for the purpose of prostitution or debauchery or any other immoral purpose. The act assumed that all female prostitutes were helpless victims with no agency of their own. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court quickly concluded that women who willingly crossed state lines could be tried for conspiring to transport themselves. Marlene Beckman studied all the female violators of the Mann Act who were sent to Alderson, the first federal prison exclusively for women. That's the only picture I have that is not from a federal document. That's a newspaper article about female members of the Dillinger Gang. Okay. Alderson, the first federal prison exclusively for, oh, by the way, Martha Stewart went to that one. During the first decade it was open after 1927. 23% of the women had not been traveling for any financial reason, but at least one of the partners was married to someone else. In other words, they were sent to prison during the Mann Act because either she was married and traveling with someone other than her husband, or he was married and she was not the wife. 23% of the women had not been traveling for financial, 16% had been paid to have sex with someone other than the man she was traveling with, typically at the insistence of her husband or partner. 15% were prostitutes who had crossed borders to reach customers, and almost half of the convicts were women working as madams or procurers. Procurer, the more common word is pimp. The year after the Mann Act passed, 1911, saw the release of Mary Connington's report on the relation between occupation and criminality of women. She argued that the alleged relationship between immorality and women in modern jobs was a myth, or at least much more complicated than it appeared. She offered the following example from an unnamed worker especially qualified to speak on the subject. He said, "The belief you mention in the general immorality of women is certainly widespread, but I have found nothing to prove it well-grounded. In the course of some investigations into the methods by which department stores seek to secure and retain the trade of the professionally immoral woman." In other words, he's a trade which, as you probably know, is considered exceptionally valuable. In other words, he's saying that department stores really wanted to have prostitutes as customers. Okay? So how did they do that? I came on something which may throw some light on this. Mr. X, who was first a department manager in several large stores and then established his own millinery business, has found that the best way of gaining and holding the trade of the prostitutes was by having a forewoman who was in with such women, which of course meant that she herself led an immoral life, thus being able to meet them in the way of friendship and to gain their trade in a natural manner. But, I said, didn't you find that such a forewoman had a bad effect on your other employees? In other words, hiring a prostitute or ex-prostitute as a department manager, wouldn't that lead the clerks working for that person to bad habits? Yes, he replied, she certainly did get some of the others into her habits, but as soon as I found that they were going that way, I fired them. During World War I, Congress created the Interdepartmental Social Hygiene Board to prevent, and this is one of their publications, to prevent and treat venereal diseases. The major concern was the increase in such illnesses in the armed forces. The federal government created a 5-mile sanitized zone around military reservations. Suspected prostitutes who were found there could be forcibly examined, and if venereal diseases were found, they would be sent to a facility. The program, restricting the activities of such women, lasted 27 months and boasted of preventing 260,000 infections. More than 15,000 women, and no men, were arrested in this way, and according to a modern writer, incarcerated in detention houses for an average stay of 10 weeks, or reformatories for an average stay of a year. The institutions included hospitals, an industrial farm, a girls' detention ward, an industrial school for colored girls, and a welfare home for women. 17 of these federally supported institutions had guards or watchmen, barbed wire fences, or both. Modern scholar Kimberly Riley argued that this period marked a change in the American view of the sexes. In Victorian times, the assumption was that wicked men were seducing innocent girls. Now the girls were seen as sullying virtuous soldiers. In 1920, the ISHB, that's the board, produced a study of 6,000 case records of delinquent women and girls. This contained much data on the females who were considered the greatest problems faced by the board. 70% of them had gonorrhea, syphilis, or both. The average age of these females varied from 18 to 22, depending on the state. One delinquent in New York was 7 years old. One in Georgia was 80. As Riley noted, policymakers legally and discursively conflated young women who participated in casual sex with prostitutes. In fact, the section of the 1920 report titled Sex History stated that 10% of the 6,000 worst cases had no convictions of any kind. Almost 80% had been convicted of sex offenses, though. Almost half were either irregular or professional prostitutes. More than 20% were promiscuous, though not for money. When asked the reason for their first sexual experience, those 6,000 women gave many answers. These were the 5 most common, in order of frequency. Love, promise to marry, rape, needed money, bad company. Okay. By the way, it notes that we only have the woman's word for all these. We don't know whether it was true or not. 42% of the women were married, including common law marriages. Almost 30% were living with their husbands. Almost 15% were in the category of divorced, deserted, separated, widowed, or bigamous marriages. The FBI Uniform Crime Reports first singled out prostitution and commercialized vice from other crimes, sex crimes, in 1933, its 3rd year. Oddly enough, it doesn't give the number of arrests or convictions, but only the number of arrested persons with previous convictions on the subject, also divided by race. The following year it reported 42,000 women charged and held for prosecution of prostitution. Prosecution and commercialized vice is still reported in the Uniform Crime Reports. In 2014, the number of arrests was estimated at 47,000, a few thousand more than it was in the 1930s. During World War II, the battle against prostitution and venereal disease was headed by the Social Protection Division of the Office of Community War Services. It was overseen by Elliot Ness of the Untouchables. Okay. While the board in World War I emphasized confining infected women, the OCWS showed more interest in treating them and improving their lives. One of its publications noted, if the promiscuous girls go back to promiscuity, if the prostitutes go back to their trade, if the low-paid workers and stranded girls leave the rapid treatment centers only to face the same problems and difficulties which led them to contracting a venereal disease, medical treatment will be only a momentary pause in the vicious circle. In the last few decades, federal attention has focused more on juvenile prostitution and on human trafficking, also called trafficking in persons. The Women's Bureau described this crime in 2002. Sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force or fraud or coercion, in which the person induced to perform such an act is under 18, or the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjecting that person to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Of course, this can be seen as a more recent and less racist variation on white slave trafficking, with an additional recognition that not all prostitution is involuntary. And I'm done, and I'm happy to take questions. I've stunned you into silence. Questions about anything, doesn't have to be about prostitution. Want to know how overdue library books caused the Civil War? Mark.
There's been a lot of conversation about particularly government documents available only online disappearing as the result, allegedly, of individuals' power to remove those from the internet, removing them from the internet. I'm wondering if your book covered that, if you might talk a little bit about that rather important issue in erasing history.
Yeah, I did a presentation last week in which I talked about that, but I don't have those slides here. Sorry. Yes. My book does not cover anything about Donald Trump. Okay. The most recent thing in it is Hillary Clinton losing the election. Okay. George W. Bush, remember him? Here are some of the publications from the Women's Bureau which disappeared off the website while he was president. Okay. 1983 Handbook on Women Workers, Black Women in the Labor Force, Domestic Violence, Don't Work in the Dark, Know Your Rights, Outlook on Women Veterans, Women Who Maintain Families, Women's Earnings, Worth More Than We Earn, Fair Pay for Working Women. All of those publications had been on the Women's Bureau website when George W. Bush became president. They all disappeared. But don't think he didn't replace them with anything. Among the publications that he replaced them with are Hot Jobs for the 21st Century, Women Business Owners, and Women in High-Tech Jobs. So yes, government, you see my gray hair? A lot of it comes from people saying everything's on the internet. It's not. A few years ago, a friend of mine who was a librarian wrote to a government agency and congratulated them on the fact that not only was their annual report on the internet, but the previous year and the previous year before that, annual reports are all on their website, easy to find. And they wrote back and said, thank you for pointing that out. We're taking that outdated information off immediately. Okay, so yes, government information does disappear. Does everyone here know about the Wayback Machine? Raise your hand if you know about the Wayback Machine. Okay, also known as the Internet Archive. Okay. They take pictures of web pages so you can compare the way the web page looked now to the way it used to look. There is also something called the End of Term Archive, which is actually run by volunteers, libraries, along with the government printing office. At the end of each president's term, starting with Bill Clinton's, they actually take pictures of as many pages of government websites as they can so that we know what it looked like before the next president comes in. Okay? And it's perfectly reasonable for a new administration to, say, well, that's not our policy anymore. Let's replace it with something new. But it's really scary when things disappear. Yes, Emily.
Even what you've learned doing this research, if you were giving advice to someone who is doing historical research on women's roles in the United States in the workforce, what kind of advice would you give them? What
kind of advice would I give to someone who's doing research about women's roles in the United States? I don't want to suggest that government statistics are less reliable than other sources of information. Okay? They're pretty darn reliable compared to a lot of sources of information, compared to your average web page, for example. But you should never accept any source on blind faith. The Associated Press used to tell their reporters, if your mother says she loves you, check it with 3 sources. Okay? And so just because the government says it's true does not necessarily mean it's true. How many of you have read last week that there have been 18 school shootings in the United States so far this year? It's not true. Okay? One of those school shootings, for example, was a man committing suicide in the parking lot of a school that was closed 6 months before. Is that a school shooting? Now, the person who came up with the figure of 18 had a bias, had an agenda. Everybody has a bias and an agenda. It's nice if they admit it. Okay? So you should definitely look at government statistics, but just as with peer-reviewed journal articles, which your professors are telling you is the best source of information, always take it with a grain of salt, use your critical thinking skills, and check. I can show you a web page that has nothing on it except retractions of scholarly peer-reviewed journal articles that turned out to be wrong. And it is a very busy website. Okay? Other questions? Come on, students. Yes?
What were some of the biggest misconceptions that this poor data gathering has created?
Oh, what were the biggest misconceptions that the bad data gathering had created? I'm glad you asked that one. 1940 census, okay? When they did the 1940 census, they realized, remember the thing about women in unusual occupations? Okay? It had been getting worse over time. And by 1940, they realized that they had been changing women's occupations incorrectly and saying, oh, this person can't be a factory worker and getting rid of it. And in 1940, they realized it was so obviously wrong, they had to do one of 3 things. Either say, oh, we've been wrong all along, and here are the correct figures. 1910, 1920, 1930 were all wrong. Or they could say, well, we're going to leave the figures from the other censuses the way they are, but we're going to make the 1941 the actual correct figures. Okay? Or they could say, just keep lying. What do you think they did? They just kept lying. Okay? So they kept artificially decreasing the number of women in these non-traditional roles. What happened in 1941? The war. We entered the war. And suddenly they were saying, we need women in factories. We need women in factories. And the newspapers went and looked and said, my God, look, there's thousands and thousands more women in factories than there were in 1940. So it was actually good for morale. Okay? There were a lot more women in factories during the war than before, but it wasn't as dramatic as people thought because the census had been lying to them. So is that a good result or a bad result? You tell me. Other questions? Okay, how many of you had to come here as a class assignment? Okay, good. Hope you got something out of it. Well, thank you very much for coming.